exciting session. If the previous record of the interaction between these two fabulous people is any indication whatsoever, those of you who've been watching Kreyol on YouTube, for example. So a brief introduction, since neither of them need an introduction. All of you are familiar.
May I take a minute and introduce you? The chair of the session. Yeah.
Who I am, that is true.
Yes. If I may.
So Stephen believes you need to be introduced, Dilip.
No, nothing like that. I think you're the most popular one.
Where we all introduce each other, that will take up the entire session.
Welcome everyone to the session, to the conference, Globalization and New Terrains of Consciousness, Phenomenologies of the Global, Local, Glocal. So welcome you all to the second plenary session, which will be something like a Glocal Le Tinnai Kreyol, something like Tinnai Adda. And the chair for this session is Professor Dilip Menon. He is the Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand. Currently, he is working in his center in interdisciplinary and transnational approach and looking afresh on issues of colonialism, modernity, and migration in the global south. Over to you, Professor Menon.
Thanks, Stephen. Now that I've been introduced and people know who I am. So to get on to introducing our two speakers for today, we have Professor Ananya Kabir, who is the Professor of English Literature at King's College London. And we have Ari Gautier, who is from Pondicherry, but resident in Oslo, writer, poet, thinker of Kreyol. And one of the things that is central to the project that Ananya inaugurated way back in 2013, the Modern Moves, which looked at the circulation of African heritage, social dance, and the world that it creates, was that she moved us outside the world of binary colonialisms to a polycolonial space, to the space of continuous oceans, so that we were not looking at the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and so on as having separate histories, but looking at the world as made through the migration of people, of ideas, of cuisine, of music, of embodied movement. And this was a significant departure in the way we thought about coloniality and post-coloniality. And it's interesting that her work has always occupied this interstitial space, as it were, because her very first book, which is called Paradise, Death, and Doomsday in Anglo-Saxon literature, worked with the idea of the interim, paradise between death and doomsday. And in many senses, this idea of being in between is something that has been hugely productive. Because if we think about Ari's work as well, the idea of the Tinnai, the threshold, which is the Tinnai is the word in most Dravidian languages for the threshold, which is neither of the inside nor of the outside, but because it is the threshold, it allows for a participation of observing what goes on and for multiple flows to happen. So I won't go on any further because we have to keep to time, but these ideas of creolization, the idea of Allegro Politics, which Ananya has spoken about, the idea of joy, mirth, amusement as central to human experience, which also rescues us from our notions of history, which think about modernity as being about abjection, where colonialism produces abjection, despondency. And here it's about the unintended consequences of colonialism, which set into motion people and a creolization which moves across multiple forms. So this is over to the two of them. And very early on, they had a conversation with a wonderful academic who wrote a book called Fabulous, The Beautiful Eccentric. So now I invite the two beautiful eccentrics to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilip. Thanks to everybody who's invited us. Of course, this wonderful team at Jamia Millia Islamia, such an important space for all of us. Very emotional attachment, of course, that I have to this institution because of my family's history. But I'm so glad to be here with my collaborator, Ari Gautier, the co-founder of the Tinnai Kreyol. So, without any further ado, let us invite you to imagine a scene, a cemetery in Pondicherry. To be precise, the White Cemetery in Pondicherry, that in 1825 was constructed over a temple for Murugan. a man sits on a tomb, puffing on a cigar, puffing on a surutu actually, and trying to enjoy the light nocturnal breeze. He knows how to deal with the noisy bunch of spying ghouls hanging from the branches of the Veppamaram, Nimgach in Bangla. He launches in that direction a brick that has escaped from a nearby tomb. But what to do with these two unexpected characters who seem to be having some kind of a fight on his own tomb?
Tripod Dog Baba and Koravan are the two characters. So Tripod Dog Baba is a character I created for my first book, Kanesuka Lakshmi, which is a 3.5-legged dog, street smart dog, who pretends to be a guru. And people who knows Pondicherry knows how many fake gurus that we have in Pondicherry. So he's one of them. And Koravan is a vagabond, a guy who loves life, who likes to is surutu and is sarayam. So these two are part of my short stories everywhere, and they bring out some memories that we forgot.
So Tripod Dog Baba and the Koravan are actually equally surprised to see this person materialize out of thin air on the tomb that they are sitting and having a chat on. So obviously, Tripod Dog Baba is, he's Tripod Dog Baba. He's always interested in what's going on. So he's like, what's your name? Who are you? Is that your grave that you're sitting on?
Quel idiot s'assierait sur une tombe autre que la sienne? Et j'avais l'impression que tu étais un érudit. Tu ne sais même pas lire. Pourtant, c'est écrit en gros.
Listen, don't act too smart with me, okay? Just answer my question. Who are you?
Oh, je m'appelle Louis Pragasam.
Louis Pragasam? Hey, there's a street here in Pondicherry named after you. Why? Good, you're here. Tell us. Why is the street named after you? Are you a war hero? Are you a politician? What are you?
Parce que je suis célèbre et connu.
Célèbre? Connu? Mais pourquoi? Why? How come? What have you done?
Oh, parce que j'ai voyagé avec l'amiral suffren, Pierre Andre suffren de Saint-Tropez.
Oh my. The great Vice Admiral Satan himself, Pierre Andre de Suffren of Saint-Tropez, bailiff of the Order of Malta, who led the French Navy against the English and the Dutch, no less. Wow. So, okay, right. So you fought against him. Okay, respect. Hey, Monsieur Pragasam, what's up? You seem to have gone rather pale all of a sudden. Koravan, what's bugging our new friend?
Listen, Tripod Dog Baba. Firstly, he is not Pragasam. Call him as Suffren did, Ragashen. This guy is no military hero, please. Yet, he sailed with Suffren, but not to fight. He was part of a stranger story. He was a kind of go-between, maestri, who set aside to Malta with 252 highly reputed weavers and spinning women from Pondicherry, who on the 25th September 1783 disembarked in Marseille.
What? What on earth? Why did Suffren take these weavers to Marseille? I mean, what happened? What was going on? Did anybody receive them? I mean, tell us more.
Well, not really, because nobody was there to receive them, and nobody gave a damn. But at last, in October 1875, the authorities sent them off to a chateau in Thieu, which is like 60 kilometers from Paris. And then this 14-man, 38 women, 12 weavers, 1 barber, 1 dhobi, 4 reelers, 26 spinners, and 6 women whose role were unclear.
So these are the people who landed up at the chateau in Thieu.
Yes.
But this is crazy. What a bizarre plan. I mean, so firstly, you bring these weavers from Pondicherry. You want to take them to Malta, but something happens in Malta. They disembark instead in Marseille. They're hanging around there, don't know what to do. And then they land up in the chateau in Thieu. And they're all there in the chateau like an indefinite period. My God, what was going on? What must have been going on there?
But actually, the entire project ended up in a big mess.
I can imagine.
First, it became pretty quickly clear that these weavers only knew how to work with coarse yarn, unlike the Muslims, Bengali magicians. So that was not expected from them. Then tensions broke between them because of, well, promiscuity, I would say, and huddled together in the cellar. The place became a place where they lived, where they worked, and even a prison, because when you misbehave, they put you in the prison in the same place. And then their condition become hellish. Within 2 years, there were deaths, births.
Birds? Birds? What are you talking about? What do you mean to say? Well, birds?
Yeah, indeed, God knows. But despite all this, they seems to have enjoyed themselves. They had a good time.
But there weren't any couples. You said there were all these different men and women who went because of different professional reasons. Some were weavers, some were spinners, some were reelers. But how many children were born?
A dozen.
What?
A dozen of them. We didn't know in any case, we didn't know what this 6 woman role were in
those 6 women, the inconnu, avec le rôle inconnu.
Yeah.
Well, listen, this is pretty impressive. A dozen children born in that cellar. That lot sure knew how to keep themselves busy. Anyway, okay, so what happened to this new community of the cellar?
Well, since these guys didn't know how to work the proper way, they were sent back to Pondicherry in 1787. And then it was 16 men, 30 women, 12 children left here to Lorient. And 10 months later, July 21st, 1788 to be precise, they landed in Pondicherry. And then Louis Pregasson was honored with a street in Pondicherry.
Unbelievable. Now, okay, so this has been, very interesting little excursus into one of your short stories, Ari, Les Tisserands de Thieu, the Weavers of Thieu. And it's an absurd tale. It could have come straight out of your imagination, but as we know, truth is sometimes stranger than fiction. And it seems that these facts are actually straight from the archives.
Yeah, true. But you know very well how much I'm interested in the streets of Pondicherry.
Yes.
So I'm doing a huge project of telling the streets of Pondicherry through literature and combining history with fiction. So most of these characters, most of this history are true. And I put the fiction behind with Tripod Dog Baba and the Koravan. And while searching for, like, Nainyapa is one of my favorite characters. I'm doing all the research, but Nainyapa, Louis Pregasson, Tille Mestri, for example, who got hanged by the colonial system. So I'm trying to retrieve all the stories and tell a new version of these forgotten stories. So while searching for Louis Pregasson, I stumbled into the Tisserands de Thieu, and with deeper research, I came to know what really happened, and I fictionalized it.
That's well, you know that I love the story, right?
And why do you like the story? First of all, you tell me.
Well, I mean, to be honest, we discovered this. I discovered this story because Adrija Roy Chaudhary, one of our favorite journalists, she's a very good historical journalist based in the Indian Express, and she called us because she wanted to do a story on cemeteries, on colonial cemeteries, and we were talking to her. And in this conversation, I mean, by the way, everybody, that's a very fantastic article. It's out there on the web, on the Indian Express. You can look at it. But as a result of this conversation, you mentioned, Ari, that you have this, your short story, the Tisserands de Thieu, is about cemeteries. Now, of course, I'd heard of the name of the short story, but I thought it was about weavers. So now it was apparent there was something else about it. So I went to read it, and I was absolutely hooked because it's extremely funny in a kind of macabre and surreal kind of a way. But I want to talk about that later in our presentation here. But most importantly, in the beginning, but in the context of our presentation, actually, and the theme which we are addressing in this conference, it seemed the best starting point. I mean, from the streets of Pondicherry, named after a Mestri or a go-between, to the chateau where the weavers were interred, I mean, to the ship that both took them there and brought them back, and finally the cemetery where the surreal encounter, which you're fictionalizing, is taking place between a dog, Koravan, and the ghost of Louis Prakasam. I mean, basically, the story is taking us literally to globalization's creation of new terrains of consciousness, several terrains, in fact, both historical terrains and also in the mind of the writer, the terrain of your consciousness. So, I mean, it's no accident, I think, that hunting for streets led you to the weavers, these unfortunate weavers, because, as you also have taught me through our own conversations together, it's textiles that ensured Pondicherry's place in the history of globalization. And in turn, as you show us through the short story in unexpected ways, local space was transformed in multiple and unpredictable manner. So I think that's why I like the story. But I mean, I think you have quite a lot to tell us, I think, about globalization, textile, vis-a-vis Pondicherry.
Yeah, you know, in my book, Lutina, I wrote 2 chapters about Byzantium, the tissue, the cloth that the French people came to Pondicherry. And it's interestingly the event we made with our friend, the artist from Panama. What's his name?
Antonio Jose Guzman.
Yeah, Antonio Jose Guzman. We told the story of how the Indian was taken to Senegambi, and as a kind of currency, exactly, as currency to buy slaves to send them to the Caribbean. So it's very interesting how when I wrote the thing, I really wanted to tell that part of the story, how Pondicherry, as a local small town, become global in a more what you call material culture perspective. So it's interesting to tell the story of the textile, and the more it goes, the more I'm convinced there are more to see in that, because Stefan Jayseelan, fantastic historian, has written beautiful books about the textile, the importance of textile in the Pondicherry perspective. So my next novel, La Saga Kreyol, is going to open up a little more the horizon and to understand more about this material exchange between countries and colonial system.
Of course, this book that we are both reading now, Lisa Oliver's Art, Trade and Imperialism in Early Modern French India, I think also really illustrates beautifully how, I mean, this work that Jayseelan already has done very empirically. You know, he's given us extraordinary detail about the movement of these textiles, you know, from antiquity really to the colonial period and beyond. But what Lisa Oliver does, which I really enjoy, and you're the one who drew attention of this book, you know, to me, is how she shows it's not just about textile. It's really about the creation of taste, the circulation of objects, technologies, you know, and in this way, what unfolds through these stories is what we call the archipelago of fragments, in a way. I think it's really our way of bringing in considerations of the archipelagic, which of course has been theorized by a number of thinkers from the Pacific, you know, for example, to the Atlantic world, but even more poetically, like Otmar Etter, in Germany, who works with the trans-archipelagic. So these different kinds of ways of thinking archipelagically, what we've done, I feel, I think it's a moment to articulate that we are trying to bring it back to the Indic space, and in the Indic space, what happens is that we are reorienting the diasporic vector. So as you show in your story of the weavers, it's not just, I like that story because it's not just about like the so-called coolies, the indentured laborers leaving, it's about the return as well. It's about circuits. And it's about how these circuits then cannot but transform the place, the space of Pondicherry itself, and material culture then becomes a way to bring back those vectors of movement to rethink the impact of the global on the local. And in fact, another really good book that I'm grateful to Professor Menon for reminding us about, which is The City of Blue and White, Chinese Porcelain and the Early Modern World by Anne Heritzen, which I've been reading avidly in the last few. And it's a very good companion to Lisa Oliver's book, actually, because she's talking about how porcelain, which we are most, blue and white porcelain, we are thinking of always in terms of how it impacted the global taste, you know, from the Dutch onwards, and how it moved outwards from China. And she's literally turning the gaze back to Jingdezhen, which is the place where the blue and white porcelain has been produced for centuries. But she shows exactly how that came to be, and the way she, and I'm going to just read out a line from her introduction where she says, in terms of methodology, I argue that global and local history need to be integrated and should be seen as forming part of the same continuum. And and she said the connection between the Chinese empire and the wider world are so numerous and intricate that we cannot but write the history of the Chinese empire as global history. So in a similar way, I think we cannot, when we think of the archipelago of fragments, we are literally thinking about different ways in which these fragmented spaces and sites, fragmented by a different kind of understanding of modernity than perhaps that was prevalent at that moment when these textiles were circulating, for example. And that fragmentation, we don't want to create a new whole. We want to keep that fragmentation, but we want to think of a new epistemology to connect it, which involves back into that picture, brings back the sites on the Indic Peninsula space itself. So, you know, that's the way we are working with material culture. And I think textile is a very good way to show that happening.
No, it's interesting, Ananya, what you're saying about the China. You know that in Pondicherry in 1972, Jean Filiosa and another researcher from the Institut Français de Pondicherry, in 1972, they found a lot of China in this side of the canal, on the white side, the white town.
Yeah.
Right? And which was nobody was aware. And people were thinking that this comes from the French, of course, obviously. But it happened to be that the Dutch really started the China business in Pondicherry. And interestingly, they used to take the China from Canton through Jakarta, and Jakarta they to bring to Pondicherry, make an atelier de surdécor, means there's a production center in Pondicherry who was producing for the European market, and and also adding some local pattern or style or design over the already brought from China. But atelier de surdécor, one has to understand, it already existed in the 1616 in Jahangir court. So it's not something new in the Indic space, but it came to Pondicherry in the 18th century, and then it was mass produced, and sent over all over the world. Even in Maastricht, they have Pondicherry China, which is called the Egyptian. So it's interesting how all this material moves from one place to another, take a different pattern, and redistribute it to the European market.
I mean, these are the material histories of Pondicherry, actually, which are the motors for us of creolization, because what you're talking about is creolization. Some technique of sous-decor, so-called, already existed in the Indic space. But the new impetus for reformulating or reusing that technique to fashion material culture destined for the European market, but has come from China via Jakarta. I mean, this is really how we see creolization, a theory of cultural encounter and production, which we bring to peninsular India through this matrix of the archipelago of fragments. And why do we do so? I mean, of course, we are interested in these things. We enjoy thinking about these, but there, as we know, Arif, there are some deeper considerations motivating us. We do so to reopen questions of history, memory, creativity, and of course, resistance. Because the creolizing enclave then emerges not as an exception, but as the paradigmatic Indic space. The lives of Creole things creates a Creole habitus that already folds into itself the so-called polluting and impure modes of behavior. The Indic body that emerges is at home in these practices. And it is a creolizing and creolized body. It is not a Brahminical body, you know, we want to put the creolized and creolizing Indic body as the Indic body. And there is, of course, resistance. Nothing happens smoothly. And it is that play of push and pull. That is the negotiation also that is creolization. This includes what I have called decreolizing impulses to fit or readjust or challenge those dominating notions of purity in the Indic space. And in fact, this push and pull can be seen actually as a re-signifier, as a recreolization, in a way. Decreolization itself, if we go above one level, a metacritical level, it is another way of recreolizing. So I think, for example, what you have a very interesting hint here in the short story, where in the dialogue that we omitted, because we can't put everything in half an hour, there is a little discussion between your characters. The Koravan taunts Louis Pragasam by calling him Louis Ragashen. And then the ghost says, no, I'm Pragasam. And the street in Pondicherry, which started the whole business, the story, is also Louis Pragasam Street, right? I mean, I want you to tell us a little bit about these nuances, because I think it's important in this context.
Oh, it's very simple. In 1881, when the French implemented the system of renoncement, where people has to renounce their religion and customs, and people has to choose, first of all, has to become Christian, and also to choose a French name. And in some cases, they just modify the Indian name and make it more French.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So he got the name Louis because he got baptized and became Christian. So instead of giving a French name, they made his Pragasam as Ragashen. And if you see, most of the indentured labor who went to Réunion, Guadeloupe, and Mauritius, they have the same type of writing.
Orthographic changes, basically.
Yeah, exactly. The Krishnasamy becomes Krishnasamy. So the R is disappeared. So this is what Pragasam became Ragashen. And he was very happy with that till 1960.
Because on your blog, Rudralingam, where the short story appears, by the way, if people want to read the short story in French, it's there on Ari's one of his blogs where he puts his short stories, Rudralingam overblog. Anyway, in that blog post, you have included some archival images, and there is a signature of Louis Ragashen. It's very clear that that's the way he's spelling his name.
Exactly. So in 1962, just before the French left the country, they asked for people to become option. They had to choose between being Indian or French. So at that time, Ragashen, he wanted to erase his past as a Renaissance. He wanted to become more Indian.
You mean Ragashen's descendants? Sure.
Descendants, exactly.
Yeah.
Not we, of course. Ragashen descendant, he was still a ghost sitting on the tomb. The Ragashen descendants, they said they want to give back that the pureness, the purity of the name, not Ragashen anymore, but Pragasam. So this is what goes to what you said.
Well, indeed, but Ari, I mean, as the appearance of the ghost signifies, I think, in your story, there is a haunting of the past. You cannot, is this Pragasam? This Pragasam cannot be the same Pragasam. I mean, Ragashen has intervened, decisively. So this composite creolized, even memory is creolized as a result. So that's what I mean, actually, when I say that decreolization itself can be a memory of creolization and a signifier of recreolization. It's a push and pull. So I really like that nuance in your story, because it tells us about this the dynamism of Creole existence, and nothing is static. There's always and how things also change in the post-colonial nation, in this case post-colonial India, into which once French Pondicherry has been absorbed. So by emphasizing such dynamics, I think it's fair to say, Ari, that we are trying to produce in different ways a reading of culture that devalorizes. It doesn't forget the dominating notions of purity, but it devalorizes them, and doesn't and insist that they cannot be a starting point. We actually want to challenge what we would call, I guess, a Brahminical epistemology that shows that starts from what the Brahmin sees. And I find this an upper caste oculocentrism, which, of course, in the high Brahminical Indic mode, does align itself to certain sense impression. Because we're talking about the sensorium. We want to talk about the sensorium today. So when we think of the sensorium, there are the 5 senses, and some senses are the haptic senses, the closer senses, and the others are the further senses. And of course, touch is the preeminent haptic sense. But I think what we do is we shift away from oculocentrism to embrace the closer senses, touch, taste, smell, and even sound. I think then through the Kreyol paradigm becomes reabsorbed into the body rather than become this high Brahminical, recitation of the Vedas and all that. We are really reorienting the way we think about the sensorium, which in a Brahminical epistemology, I would say really exists only in forensic and juridical modes. We are bringing it back to impact the body as the starting point, the sensorium and this is how we reconfigure also material culture, because it is about taste and touch and how you appreciate and understand that material culture as being part of the Kreyol habitus. And of course, we are, as Prakasam himself shows us, the mystery, we shift our gaze to the go-betweens, the brokers, the merchants, the vagrants, the Koravas, the Parai drummers, the adventurers, the charlatan dogs who traffic across borders and across categories in the space of your imagination, of course, which is Pondicherry, but we extrapolate from there, to think more widely about what all this signifies. But where I want us to go now, Ari? Where we want to go now, right?
To Allegro Parai.
But via the space of the cemetery, because it's not just the archival story. You've put it in a cemetery.
Exactly. I wanted to make the cemetery as a place of joy, where people sit, drink, smoke, dance, and being absurd. This is Allegro Politics. From Negro Politics, we go to Allegro Politics.
Well, it's true. Well, my own idea of Allegro Politics, which I formulated through the project on African heritage dance that Professor Menon alluded to in the beginning, Dilip knows all about it, because it was really very early on in 2013 when I started the project that I was in Johannesburg, and we had a wonderful discussion at a seminar at the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, where it was the first time that I mentioned many of the things that were later theorized, so he knows the trajectory of the project only too well. But Allegro Politics is where I arrived at the end of that project, and it was indebted to somebody else, of course, who is at Johannesburg and whom we have learned so much from, Achille Mbembe, with his extremely important article, Necropolitics. And from Necropolitics, I actually derived Allegro Politics as a counter to the idea that the body is, of course, Necropolitics states the body is the ultimate place of sovereignty, but it looks at death, as the vanishing point, of this taking your own life, taking your life in your own hands. And for me, I'm like, no, Allegro Politics is my vanishing point. So, of course, this idea has appealed to us because you were also, long before you met me, you were writing the story. And this is a story, again, where necropolitics, the necropolitics of the cemetery is transformed into an Allegro political space. We didn't get time in our little dialogue excerpt to talk about all the things that goes around in the cemetery, but you want to tell us how you've described, say, the Koravan, or what's he doing in there?
I think time is off, but we are off. I think
we've got 5 minutes.
I don't know.
Well, you take 2 more minutes, please, and then
we have to wrap up. We are on our way to ending. But don't worry, Dilip. We keep our eyes on the clock. Ari, I just want you to tell us a little bit about the cemetery, and then we'll of course bring it to a close.
As I said, I'm still saying that the cemetery is not a place of what you call sadness or abject. It's a place of joy, and that's one of the reasons when the Parayan carries death is play the Paramolam with joy and dance and drink. So the joyness for the Parayan that I am, I want to bring it over to a different level.
I like the way that you say the parai that I am, because one of the things we are doing on the Tinai Kreyol is putting our own non-Brahminical subjectivities very, very clearly in the space of discussion and debate. So I think it is no accident that our idea of the Allegro combines with different kinds of abjected bodies and practices in our theorization. We used in the topic, in the title of this paper, we used Alegromitya, which comes from the idea of the Girmitya, another word for the kuli, which we prefer because the Girmit goes to a number of agreements and permits, which we prefer over the kuli. But Girmitya, Allegria is Alegromitya, but we have also more recently done work on the Allegro Parai, which is the Allegria of the Parai drums. And since the Parai drums, of course, were played at cemeteries and for funeral processions, again, it's a concrete way of talking about the conversion of necropolitics to Allegro politics. So I think at this point, let us end here then. I think we've given people enough food for thought, but we really want to confirm or rather reiterate our interest through the Tinai Kreyol and the work we do on distancing ourselves phenomenologically from this kind of Brahminical understanding of Indic space and the Indic body by focusing on and celebrating through Allegro politics and its various declinations the impurity of Kreyol and the decentering epistemology of the Archipelago of Fragments. So thank you everybody for being with us, and let's hope there are a few minutes for some questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ari and Ananya, for that conversation, that talk, that swirl of ideas, where you began in a cemetery, which was joyous. We entered the street to have a number of conversations. We got onto the ship and were deported and made children. And then we were caught up in shards of pottery and reams of textiles and an archipelago of fragments which you knitted together very beautifully. And certainly alongside Allegro politics was the fact that your talk was Allegro rather than Andante. So things went past us at a very rapid pace. So I opened this talk up to questions. We have 10 minutes. And I think I'll leave it to Stephen and the other commissars to now regulate time.
Then, so towards the end, Ari seems like the Emma Goldman of the cemetery, who will say that if I can't dance, I won't be in your revolution. So if I can't dance, I won't be in your cemetery. So there's one question in the chat box, which is to Ari. In Time's Monsters, Priya Satya writes, the worldly discipline of history emerged from the ancient swirl of poetic myth, texts like the Mahabharata and the Odyssey, that defy easy categorization as a fact of fiction, theological texts, or humanistic artifacts. I was wondering how you deal with the often fraught relationship between the discipline of history versus storytelling in your work.
Well, it's a long question. My answer will be shorter than the question. See, me as a writer, I take all the liberty that which is given to me to interpret and reinterpret historical facts. But of course, my research, while I do writing, are very, very serious. And people who read my books or my short stories know how much rigorous I am in my research. But I am just keeping the historical facts as just a base, which I built on my characters and to my own way of narrating the story. So this is my methodology, if I can call it. So yeah.
Just to keep the conversation going, I think one of the most significant ideas that comes out of your joint intervention is the fact that the way in which you've studied colonialism, the post-colonial and so on, is inflected by melancholy, it's inflected by notions of abjection and so on. And I think there's something that you do, which is very post-colonial, like as you say, the move from necropolitics to Allegro politics. So could you say something about what does it mean to talk about, speak about these spaces of joy, miscegenation, song, music, and dance? Does it help us to recover a certain sense of self, a post-colonial self? Is that where this work is going? Or is it about the excess? Where the excess of history, as it were. So it's not just about individual reconstitution, but it's about thinking about spaces in the world which always exceed the hubris of power. I'll stop there.
Ari, do you want to answer?
You go, yeah, please.
Well, I think in this we are again very nicely in agreement. Ari and I, we came. We've only been working together for a year, but we came to this point of convergence from paths that were that were quite similar in our different ways. And yes, I think there is all that you said, Dilip, actually is constitutive of what we are trying to do. It is a move to retrieve Alegria. Allegro Politics is certainly working on our individual bodies. To experience, firstly, it's embodied. That's why we like the idea of the sensorium, So when we're talking about an embodied experience, of course, the first plane of that experience is your own body. So we can't absent ourselves as individuals from this space of experience, but the individual is always interpolated, connected, and it is also a collective experience. Allegro Politics, you can't be having Allegro Politics all by yourself. This is why my space for theorizing it came from the dance floor. It really makes no sense to think about it as an individual. It is felt in the individual body, but it is sensed as a collective and cumulative experience. Therefore, there is the sense of excess, and there is a sense always of an excess that challenges and reconstitutes again the hubris of power, as you say. Interestingly enough, Ashil also talks about it in his book on the post-colony, where different kinds of sardonic humor, different kinds of embodied expressions are the ways in which on this micropolitics of the street, the hubris of power is challenged. So one remains, in conversation with him, of course. So Alegria, for example, in the story that Ari gave us, it can permeate different levels. He's talking about this macabre joy that's being derived in the place of melancholia. So there is always this abjection. There is a traffic. It cannot ever be one without the other. That's why the political. It's not just Alegria, it's Allegro Politics. However, there is also, on the writerly level, as a literary critic, I will see that in his own writing, there is Alegria. He's enjoying writing this story, this crazy story, and I am enjoying reading it. So, there is Alegria on several levels, which is political. Now, in terms of the post-colonial, of course, yes, we are post-colonial. We are post-colonial subject, but don't forget that we're also trying to complicate and nuance the idea of the post-colonial. The Kreyolization, the idea of Kreyolization with multiplicities that are inevitably involved help us to think of what Shogata Bhaduri has called the polycolonial. He's called the polycolonial in terms of Bengal. But what I think we need to still do with the idea of the polycolonial is give it a multiplicity and a simultaneity. His reading of the polycolonial, I don't know if he's here today, but he was certainly here yesterday, I think. His reading of the polycolonial, for me, it appears as very linear. I mean, first the Dutch came, then first there was the Portuguese, then the Dutch. So, for us, it's more the sedimentations then started swirling. And so the post-colonial itself becomes very complicated. Deliberately, we complicate the idea of the post-colonial. There is no one line that leads to the post-colonial. And so in the Indic space, we want to bring back these seemingly small dots of the French post-colonial, the Goan post-colonial, etc. But we make more of it so that we can challenge different kinds of, of certainties, of, okay, we know it all, etc. So we return to the idea of the post-colonial, but we bring new things. So Kreyolization, Allegro Politics, etc. They're all our tools to do this.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Ananya. And since Ashil Mbembe was like a specter over this conversation, hung over our thinking, his most recent translation, Out of the Dark Night, a book written in 2010, but available in English as of last year, he talks about post-colonialism as about imagining newer forms of community. And I think this is what your work allows us to do, where it is reminding us. It's reminding us of the way the world was outside the prison house of colonialism and nationalism. So thank you very much, the two of you, and we'll move on to the next session.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
So thank you very much, Professor, for chairing this session and holding this conversation. And thank you so much to Ari and Ananya. I think you have transgressed this space of academic conference by bringing the fragment of your Let Innai Kreyol making it a Tinnai Adda, enabling so many conversations. And I think in our imaginative space as well, you have transgressed a lot. And definitely next time I'm going to a cemetery and going to party as well. So thank you so
Excellent.
much. Now we will be doing our next session in next